Introduction. This talk is about these 19th century notables who lived in Leicester Street, many of them where Graduate House now is, or the business school. And in fact 5 of the 6 did. The other person worked in the factory at Leicester Street just down the road. So the first one was Alexander Kennedy Smith. When he was 29, he was selected from amongst 69 applicants in the UK and Europe by the City of Melbourne Gas and Coke Company to come out and build Melbourne's first gasworks. After he signed his contract in September 1853, he immediately ordered all the parts for the gasworks, 1,300 tonnes of coal to make the gas, and this all took 12 ships to bring it all to Melbourne. Shortly after he sailed for Melbourne on the propeller-assisted sailing ship the Croesus. The journey took 3 months because the engine kept breaking down. When they're in the doldrums, it was of no use at all. Also on the Croesus, on that trip, was the Count de Chabrillon and his new wife Celeste. The Count was the first French consul for Victoria. Celeste had attracted his attention when she was a courtesan in Paris, and he married her shortly before they left London, despite the family opposition. And unfortunately for Celeste, when she thought the Count wasn't going to marry her, she published her highly salacious memoirs, which she had written. And because of the slow trip of the ship, the memoirs got to Melbourne before she did. And so she was never accepted in polite society. Whenever there was a function, you know, at Government House or whatever, the Count was the only person who could go. On December 1st, 1854, the gasworks foundation stone was laid. The band of the 40th Regiment was marching in the parade to mark the occasion when it was suddenly withdrawn by Governor Hotham and sent to Ballarat to help put down the Eureka Rebellion. In October 1855, the topping out ceremony of the chimney to the gasworks was celebrated with a small party, a champagne breakfast on top of the chimney for the directors and friends. By December that year, the gasworks was complete. Unfortunately, at the ceremony on the 7th of December, Governor Hotham, who had come to light the first fire for the coke ovens, was drenched in a sudden storm. And as a result, he developed pneumonia and died on New Year's Eve, just before the gas was turned on New Year's Day, 1856. So there's Governor Hotham, and that was his memorial in Melbourne General Cemetery. It's about to be restored, but it's not there at the moment. In 1859, Smith's contract was complete. He left the gas company and he set up as a civil and consulting engineer with his own foundry at 43 Leicester Street, and this later moved to 54 to 56 Leicester Street. Yes, indeed. Well, there was a lot of industry close to the city in those days. He designed gasworks at Ballarat, Castlemaine, Bendigo and Newcastle, and his foundry provided all the necessary plant and equipment, and he reported and prepared plans and specifications for gasworks in Victoria, New South Wales, China, New Zealand and Japan, and in addition he consulted on water supply schemes and railway schemes. He was a major in the Victorian Volunteer Regiment, an office bearer in the Royal Society, a Melbourne City Councillor for 15 years for this area here, and Mayor for 2 years. And he was elected to the Victorian Legislative Assembly in 1876 and remained there until his death in 1881. while he was living in Leicester Street, he helped get the land for the Victorian Bowling Club at the northern end of University Square, which now unfortunately no longer exists and is the underground car park for the university. Now Louis Brennan didn't live in Leicester Street. He was a young Irishman who in 1861, at the age of 9, migrated with his family to Melbourne. By the time he was 19, he had already made several inventions, and this attracted Alexander Kennedy Smith's attention, so he employed him as an apprentice in his Leicester Street factory, where he worked from 1871 to 1880. In 1874, while he was operating a Beltram machinery, he observed that only one side of the belt, and you can see the belts here, was transmitting power to the shaft. He saw that if a belt was wound around a pulley on a shaft, it would be possible to transmit power to the shaft by pulling on the other end of the belt. He reasoned that this system could be used to propel a vessel that contained a drum wound with wire that was connected to a propeller shaft, and the other end of the wire connected to a stationary winch. As the winch wound in the wire, the shaft would rotate and drive the vessel forward. And the only vehicle he could think of where this could be used, and it had to be driven for a limited distance and didn't have to make a return journey, was a torpedo. And thus the world's first successful guided missile was invented. Brennan took out a patent on his idea and then constructed a small crude model which he took to engineering lecturer William Connell, who was living in this street, and to obtain his advice on how the torpedo would work if made to a larger scale. Connell calculated the drag on a full-sized torpedo, 7.3 metres long, and the stress in the wire. He concluded that it could reach a speed of 15 knots. He suggested using 2 wires instead of 1, which could also be used for steering by means of a differential system of wheels. Brennan patented his idea, and then he built a small model similar to this patent drawing. You can see there's one of the wheels there, or there's 2 wheels there. I won't go into the steering mechanism, it's fairly complex. Which he tested on the 28th of June 1877 in front of 2 Royal Engineers, Colonel Sir William Jarvis and Lieutenant Colonel Scratchley, who had come out to Australia to advise on harbour defence for the colonies. The wires from the torpedo were connected to hand winches. The speed obtained was 6 knots and the distance travelled was about 550 metres. The torpedo was successfully steered turning left to right by varying the speed of the winches. After the discovery of gold in Victoria in 1851, there was concern that a Russian ship could enter Port Phillip Bay and plunder Victoria's rich hoard of gold. Brennan's steerable torpedo, if it was installed at the heads, would be an ideal weapon to destroy any such ship, and without the need of an expensive outlay on extra forts and guns. And this made it an attractive proposition for the government, who, at Alexander Kennedy Smith's request, he was then in the Leicester Assembly, he requested a sum of £500 to allow the invention to have a thoroughly practical trial. £500 is equivalent to about $100,000 today. Construction of a full-scale model torpedo then started in Smith's foundry in 1878, and the full-size torpedo was trialled 11 months later with variable success. The maximum speed obtained was 13 knots over a distance of 320 metres, and the steering was excellent, but the depth keeping was poor, with the torpedo breaking the surface and then plunging deeper in the sea. The local press likened this to the action of a porpoise, and and it took another 7 years and £25,000 before the debt-keeping problem was solved. Brennan approached the government for further funds to take his invention to London, but they said, no, we've given you enough money, so he had to form a private company, and using the funds, in 1881, he took it to London to demonstrate it to the War Office. The Royal Navy wasn't interested, but the Royal Engineers thought it would be suitable for harbour defence. Trials of the Torpedo were held in the River Medway between December 1881 and May 1882. The Royal Engineers were very impressed. The Brennan Torpedo Company was paid £5,000 for expenses incurred, and Brennan was employed for 3 years at the salary of £1,000 per year to perfect the torpedo. On the 13th of October 1886, Brennan declared the improved Brennan fish torpedo is complete and fit for trial. A trial was held on the 26th of October and it was a complete success. The torpedo was fired in rough weather at a small target being towed at 17 knots. The torpedo launched at 20 knots and, directed by Brennan, struck the target, as you can see here, at the range of about 1.6 kilometres. The British government then agreed to purchase the torpedo for the sum of £110,000, which today would be worth about $23 million. £500 of which was sent to William Curnock for his assistance in developing the torpedo. This huge sum was queried in Parliament, in the British Parliament, with one member saying, what's happened there?
Continue, override.
Where's the override? Sorry. Yeah, just leave it on the live trial for that. Yeah, okay, thanks. This huge sum was queried in the British Parliament, with one member saying, is it likely that a youngster brought up in the wilds of Australia has discovered a torpedo of such value that it cannot be improved upon? Certainly not. English mechanicians will shortly discover young Brennan's secret and invent something better. We shall have paid £110,000 for nothing. Fortunately, his amendment was defeated. The £110,000 was provisional on details of the torpedo being kept secret, especially the depth-keeping mechanism. The black box that contained it was removed after each practice run of the torpedo. It was stored in a locked safe with 2 keys, a bit like a nuclear deterrent. How that depth-keeping mechanism works is still not known today. The last remaining torpedo is in the Royal Engineers Museum at Chatham. The torpedo went into full production in 1887 and was installed at 7 torpedo stations. 4 in the United Kingdom, 2 in Malta, and the last one in Hong Kong, which is now a museum of coastal defence and has this model of the torpedo in it. And there you can see the drums of wire that propel it, and at this stage the torpedo has 2 propellers, contra-rotating propellers, so the drums revolved in different directions, spinning the propellers. Despite helping to fund the original development of the torpedo and repeated requests to the British government, the Victorian government couldn't obtain any of these torpedoes for the defence of Port Phillip Bay. Initially, the British government didn't trust the colonials to keep the secret of the Brennan's torpedo. Later they said they couldn't supply any torpedoes until the imperial defence needs were met, and by the time they did say they could supply them in 1892, the financial crash had occurred and the Victorian government had no money to buy them. After Brennan stopped working full-time on his torpedo installation, he began to work on 2 other inventions. One was a gyroscopically stabilised train, There he is with his daughter in this train, which is going along a wire rope. And there's a full-size model of the train. And the other invention was this helicopter, which he started to develop during the First World War, but eventually the Air Ministry cancelled that contract too. Brennan spent a large part of his fortune trying to promote his train, and he even tried to sell it to the Australian government, as if it had been adopted, it would have solved the problem of the different gauge railway tracks in Australia, as you only needed one rail. Now, the third and fourth people of note associated with Leicester Street were William Charles Curnott and his brother Maurice Curnott. They rented accommodation at 1 Cree Terrace, 110 Leicester Street from 1872 to 1879. William Curnott attended the University of Melbourne when he was 15 and became its first graduate of engineering. After his graduation, his university qualifications were not recognised, and he had a lot of trouble getting a job. Eventually, he worked for the Department of Mines, where he was employed checking mining leases, and he later told his students that his qualifications were as useful as a punter at the South Pole or a pair of snowshoes in the Red Sea. In 1868, the university appointed him as a part-time lecturer while he was still working for the Department of Water Supply. In 1875, he was appointed full-time lecturer in engineering, and in 1883 he became the first professor of engineering, a position he held until his death. And along with 23 hours of lecturing a week, he undertook outside consulting work which proved very profitable. This enabled him to give money for scholarships at the university and £1,000 to equip a metallurgy laboratory. Some of this work included reporting on construction failures. This included the collapse under test load of a Monair arch bridge that one of your founders, John Monash, had designed. In 1882, he introduced electric light to Melbourne through the new Australian Electric Company, and he was chairman from 1882 to 1900. He was a stern critic of the engineering profession, its lack of theoretical knowledge, its reliance on empirical rules, and the use of rule of thumb method of design. He conducted a lengthy campaign against the anti-academic bias of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and he claimed to be the first man the university has set out to attack single-handed the fortress of professional ignorance and prejudice. In the late 1880s, he successfully campaigned to have the Moorabool railway viaduct reduced from a double-track railway to a single track because of his concern that it was overloaded if two trains were on the viaduct at the same time. Later, as the weight of the trains increased, extra piers were introduced and the trusses were changed to these plate girders. He was an enthusiast for ballooning, deep sea diving, and he had a steam car which he used to disguise as a railway engine and drive in the students' processions. And he claimed the record for the fastest journey on a penny farthing from Melbourne to Geelong. He was president of the Royal Society from 1885 to 1900. In 1880 he moved to a large, comfortable house he'd built in Parkville, where he lived unwed with other members of his family until his death in 1909. His brother Maurice, despite being dux of his school in Geelong, never finished his engineering course at university. He gained his engineering experience by working on the job with the Water Supply Department, the Mines Department, and from 1874 in the Railway Department. Now, whether this was because of all the problems William had, being academically trained and not being able to get a job, I don't know. He later became Chief Civil Engineer for the railways. He designed the Bairnsdale to Orvis railway line. He oversaw the building of over 1,600 kilometres of railway track, and he achieved large savings by using direct labour instead of open tender. In 1928, the Institution of Engineers awarded him the Kernock Memorial Medal. In 1883, F. Ferguson purchased the Carlton Foundry in Leicester Street from the estate of Alexander Kennedy Smith. And in 1885, he moved to 2 Summerhill Terrace, 116 Leicester Street, where he lived with his family until he moved to a large house he built in Royal Parade, Parkville. At the age of 13, he started work as an apprentice to John Price, whose Ballarat firm produced rocking cradles, ripple boxes, pumps, etc. for use by gold miners. The firm later went on to fabricate metal bridge girders, and Meth and Ferguson supervised the erection of these bridges in various parts of Victoria. In 1874, he was resident engineer for the construction of this road bridge over the Lee River at Shelford. At weekends, he would walk the 40 kilometres from the bridge site to Geelong to see his fiancée, Agnes Shand, who he married that year. They had first met when Meffin was 11 and Agnes was 5, when their families came to Australia on the ship the Admiral Boxer 20 years earlier. Shortly afterwards, he, together with Agnes's father and his brother-in-law, bought the bridge-making plant from John Price, and they were successful in tendering on 3 jobs in Melbourne and Geelong. When his father-in-law died, the name of the firm was changed to Meth and Ferguson Proprietary Limited. As well as bridge girders, the firm manufactured riveted wrought iron pipes, which were used for Melbourne's water supply, by other Victorian water supply trusts, and for the Chaffey irrigation schemes around Mildura. Because of the holes punched in the metal plate for the rivets, as you can see all the rivets there, only 50% of the strength of the metal plate could be used to resist the internal water pressure of the pipes. So late one night in 1896, he was sitting in his office when he opened a drawer of his desk and observed the dovetail joints used to join the timber in the drawer. This gave him the idea for the lock bar pipe. Next morning, a joint was made in steel and when tested proved to be 100% efficient. The idea was quickly patented, machinery was made in the factory to make the lock bar pipes. To make the pipes, the steel plate was cut to size. The edges, as you can see here, were upset by rollers to give that dovetail shape, and then the plate formed into half cylinders. 2 half cylinders were put together and the lock bar pushed along the joints top and bottom and closed by a 1,200 ton hydraulic press. Not only could the full strength of the steel in the pipe be utilised, but also the pipe had a smooth bore, unlike riveted pipes, which meant it had a 25% greater carrying capacity. And these advantages enabled the firm to win against overseas tenderers the contract for supply of pipes to the Coolgardie Goldfields Water Supply Scheme. This contract, sorry, it's a bit hard to see the slide, for 563 kilometres of pipe took water from a dam built in the Darling Ranges near Perth all the way to Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie. And the water was pumped by 8 steam-driven pumping stations along the length of the pipeline. And the pipeline has now been repaired and cement lined and is still in use today. The successful use of the lock bar pipe attracted worldwide attention, and you can see here where it ended up being used around the world. The lock bar pipe was also widely used in Australia, and some lengths of pipe are still in use in Melbourne's water supply. It wasn't until the 1930s that lock bar pipes were gradually replaced by pipes made by the use of automatic electric fusion welding. Ferguson had few outside interests. He devoted all his energies to the development of his very successful business, apart from being president of the now defunct Victorian Bowling Club in University Square. After his death in 1919, his sons ran the firm until they died, and then it was sold in 1952 to tube makers. The last person I'll speak about is Amy Castles, the soprano, who for a short time in the 1890s lived with her grandmother at 234 Leicester Street. Amy was born in Carlton in the 1880, but spent most of her girlhood in Bendigo, where her vocal ability first came to public attention. She was touted by the Catholic press to follow in Nellie Melba's footsteps, musically, but not morally. The Catholic press regarded Melba as a Protestant tart. After a series of concerts which raised several £1,000s, Amy left for Europe in September 1899 to take lessons from Matilde Marchese, Melbourne's old teacher. Marchese thought her voice was unsuitable for opera, but after lessons with another teacher, she made a debut at Queen's Hall in London in 1901. She made a successful tour in 1902. Her concert at the Exhibition Buildings attracted an audience of 20,000. She toured again in 1906, and she later secured a position at the Vienna Court Opera House, appearing 7 times. The Vienna critics found her voice small and sweet and not suited to heavy operatic roles. She left Vienna just before the start of World War I, gave a few concerts in America, and then returned to Australia to sing in the 1919-20 J.C. Williamson's opera tour. And after 1920, she gave few concerts and died without much public notice in November 1951. To quote Jeff Brownrigg, the author of A New Melba, The Tragedy of Amy Castles, she didn't achieve any form of greatness in her 1899 and 1902 performances, but rather showed potential. An important part of the tragedy was that she became very rich before she developed a solid technique. Once her career had been launched, she stopped being Amy Castles, the promising, good-natured girl from Bendigo, and became Amy Castles, the promising prima donna, and that is how she stayed. The only plaque commemorating who lived at the site of Graduate House in the past is this one on 234 Leicester Street. Perhaps the other subjects of my talk, Alexander Kennedy Smith, Louis Brennan, Professor William Kerner, and Mervyn Ferguson, are also worthy of recognition. Thank you.